We're going to go now to a quick panel. I'm going to invite Roger and Kevin back to talk about manuscript circulation and the Band of Brothers. Thanks for joining me. I completed my documentary film with Oxford's return to London. He came back from Italy, and his poems were just being published in the Paradise of Dainty Devices. There were 2 new theaters being constructed, the Theatre and the Curtain. And during the next 10 to 15 years, Oxford led a group of writers. He had a literary circle described in recent talks by Kevin Gilvary and Alexander Waugh. This is the period of Oxford's life that I'm most interested in researching now, when he lived at Fisher's Folly, where today you can see the Tesco Metro, and again, had around him a group of writers who Alexander Waugh gave us a beautiful graphic image of, where he is the center of this world of writers in London. So I'd like to start by asking Roger a question about the poetry. Stephen May is an author who's written extensively about Elizabethan Renaissance poetry and the circulation of manuscripts, and he is one of the people who identified Oxford as the author of My Mind to Me, A Kingdom Is. And
right.
I was wondering...
He was the first one to do that.
Yes.
He did it, yeah.
Exactly. So he is the person who correctly attributed it. And so I was wondering, Roger, in your research into the volumes of the poetry that you've published so far, what did you learn about the relationship between the circulation of manuscripts and attribution?
Wow, that's a really good question, and I probably should have prepared for it better. Most of the poems that are involved in the series of books on Oxford's poems that I'm working with, most of them are from published sources. I think the only ones that are not are some of the ones that Stephen May had transcribed that have Oxford's name on them. Just to clarify the history for everybody, Loney, as early as 1921, said not only did Oxford write about 20 or so poems or 30 poems, I think his list was a little longer, that under his own name, but he also wrote a bunch of other lyric poems that are not well attributed from the period. And so I've been sort of trying to investigate and test that proposition and let people know what those poems are.
Right. One of my questions related to that was that, you noted in the first volume 1 of Oxford's poetry that we have poems signed E.O., but we have another collection of poems that were attributed, again, to his contemporaries or written under a pseudonym. And my question is, does the use of pseudonyms such as Ignoto imply that the circulation of the poems was so widespread that a conscious decision was made to stop taking credit for the work at some point, as we might infer from the appearance of the name Shakespeare on the long poems?
Well, I would highly recommend, on the subject of pseudonyms, I highly recommend Alex McNeil's article. I don't have, it's on for the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, who wrote under at least 70 different names, which he didn't call pseudonyms, he called them heteronyms. And for him, and I believe this is probably true for de Vere too, the invention of the pseudonym was the first creative act. And then so you actually have, that's why he called them, Pessoa called them heteronyms. They're really sort of like beings that coexist in the artist and have their own set of artistic interests. And I think that it's very clear, not only from Pessoa, but from a number of other cases, that writers that are really into pseudonyms often use multiple pseudonyms. It is not unusual at all for that to happen. And I believe that de Vere did that as well. Although admittedly, that opens lots of questions that, have to be really debated and discussed a lot.
Sure. Thank you. And I wanted to turn to Kevin now and ask about what you've learned, what you've discovered about Oxford's involvement in the creation of the theater when he returned from Italy, particularly the Curtain. If you could just give us a few of the most significant findings from your recent talk on that topic, since we are short on time. Thank you, Kevin.
Well, in 1576, the theatre was opened, and the traditional story is that it was just Burbage and his men who got it together so as to have a public theatre. And then the curtain opened in the same precinct about a year later. I think this is all thrown into question by the discovery a few years ago of a manuscript in French of a writer, a travel writer, who described London. And he said that these two marvellous theatres, one of them was built by a great lord. Now, I think the great lord would have to be the Earl of Leicester. And certainly the theatre had far more prestige than that. And I think that he was using that as a base to prepare his players to prepare for their performance at court. And I think that the whole of the theatrical scene was intended for court performance, and then the spin-offs were going back to the theatre, performing either in preparation or afterwards for the public. As to the second one, well, it would have to be another great lord, somebody who had the money to put up for it. The only other person I could think of is Ambrose Dudley. So that was Robert Dudley's brother, the Earl of Warwick. And I think that's unlikely. And then we know that the Earl of Oxford took over Warwick's men a couple of years later. So my hypothesis, just to be very careful about it, is that Oxford set up the curtain in quite a different way. It had a very wide stage suitable for fencing jousts as well. So I believe he used that as a base for his players to prepare for their court performances.
Wonderful, thank you. And we know also that he was first working at the Savoy Hospital in the 1570s and then at Fisher's Folly in 1518. So it's generally accepted that Munday and Lilly were serving as his secretaries, but what exactly does that mean? As accomplished writers in their own right, what was their role with Oxford? Were they, I think they were not simply scribes, but perhaps editors. We know that he worked with several translators. Can you just talk a little bit about what we do know about his...
Well, I think you're right. They're not simply what we would call a secretary, but they are sort of executives, chief executive officers. So I think that they are people who are controlling other writers. I think these other writers being encouraged to write in their own way. They're certainly not writing according to a prescribed formula. And I think it's the range of literature that's emerging from there that's most impressive. And I think that these two, especially, and Oxford as well, are working together to help improve the English language, to improve literature in English. And so first of all, in the Savoy, which he was renting, and then secondly, Fisher's Folly, which is closer to the theatre, from about 1580, which coincides with when he took over Warwick's men. So I think that he just had that geographical shift. But certainly Munday and Lilly were very, very important people in terms of what they themselves were doing and how they're directing others.
Right. Did you want to comment on that, Roger?
Yeah, I just want to confirm that those two names. Churchyard is also really important, but Munday and Lilly are really, he did lots of different interesting things with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of my questions was about the overlap between the school of what's known as the School of Night, the writers known as the University Wits, and Oxford Circle. The idea that scholars flocked to Oxford and worked under his direction, particularly some of the poorer writers, that he was their patron. Any comments on that concept of what was going on there? That's what I'm most interested in researching, as I said. So, for example...
Well, yeah, well, there's a group of people around Raleigh who were, some of them were poets and literary writers, but they were wider than that. They were alchemists and they were mathematicians, and it's sort of, the School of Night has sort of gone out of fashion recently, but it's not completely out. And there's certainly references to groups of writers there, which included Marlowe. I think possibly Marlowe transferred, I think he left the Oxford stable and that he went over to the other side, as it were. I think it's a loose conglomeration. I don't think there's sort of anything particularly prescriptive about it. I think that if they were there, they were getting their board and lodging, their help with scriveners, people writing things out for them. Certainly a library and maybe translations as well. And a reading circle. They could say, here you are, Squire, what do you think of this one? I've got my new poem, my new play, whatever. And they would be able to comment on it. So I think that was working at a lower level. And then I think that there was a super level, and this is one that Stephanie Hopkins Hughes is gone in for, this elite group of writers, which included...
Oh, we've lost Kevin. He's frozen
Yeah.
for a minute there. Well, I want to follow up on that, though, because we only have a minute left. I think that is really interesting to me, the idea that it's not a fixed group necessarily. And
Yeah.
I have one other question for you, Roger, and that's about,
Oxford, Marlowe, Bacon.
Kevin, we could hear you, but we lost you. But I'm going to ask Roger to comment. Yes.
I want to say one other thing before you ask me. When we're writing about Oxford as a patron, let's remember that this is a man who wrote the word alms several times in his Bible and has underlined all of the most radical sentiments in both the Old and the New Testament about the responsibilities of wealth. So I think that's a part of the story of his early patronage before he went Timon, went up, and didn't have anything left. He went broke. Yeah. So
yeah, the idea that they were actually workshopping the manuscripts, that's what I'm looking for. I'm very grateful to the SOF for giving me a research grant to look into the circulation of manuscripts by Oxford and his contemporaries. So I'm really excited about that. And we're going to talk about your book next, Roger, but in your work on the early allusions to Oxford as Shakespeare, did you find anything that might suggest that...
Can I just make
one
more point?
Of course.
Oh, sorry to interrupt the flow. First of all, I'm very impressed if Roger...
We're still losing.
I'm sorry, Kevin, we're still not able to hear you. But Roger, my question was just about, Mears mentions the the passing of the sugared sonnets, but do you think that we might find any other evidence to suggest that either Oxford's poems or later his plays were being circulated?
Well, manuscript culture was a very, very important part of the court and a very important part of the literary scene that is somewhat invisible to us. There was lots of stuff being passed around for which there is no or very little record of it having been passed. Right. I think it's going to be challenging to find new evidence on this, but I think it's it needs to be done. The work needs to be done, and you're going to learn a tremendous amount about it, even if you don't find the smoking gun, right?
Thanks so much. Let's see if Kevin is able to make his last comment.
Sorry,
we can hear you, Kevin, if you'd like to make a comment before we go to the next panel.
Well, first of all, it's great that Roger's looking through these old miscellanies and trying to find if there are misattributed poems. And then secondly, there's a wonderful new resource, which I've only just discovered, called the Catalogue of English Literary Manuscripts, CELM. And the amazing number of copies of Oxford poems, which are handwritten in the 1580s. I've gone through it thoroughly yet, but they are certainly turning up in handwritten material at the time. So I think that there are a lot of manuscripts there that are probably worth investigating. So I've only just discovered it, I'm afraid. So I'm letting other people in on the secret.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That's really exciting. Thank you both for taking the time to talk with me, as I said, about my next project. I really appreciate your expertise. I'm going to turn it over to Earl now for the publications panel. Thanks, everyone.